I'm sorry for all the things you've had to go through since everything that's happened to you. It doesn't seem fair to me. But I just want to get into asking you some questions about some of the things you gave evidence about. I've read the transcript, though I wasn't here on Friday. But you described the issue with respect to the protesters as assaultive behavior. And I just want to clarify, by that I take it you don't mean actual physical assaults under the criminal code, do you?
Two things. Thank you for your questions. Two things. And I may have been guilty of it myself in chief. The pejorative term, the protesters, the convoy, it's not accurate. There were an amorphous group of individuals, collectives, convoys that in totality could be described as the protesters, the occupiers, but they were by no means unified in their mind or their intentions or their actions. Secondly, yes, I use the term assaultive in the broadest case possible, broadest way possible. It is my understanding that there was criminal code assaultive behavior by individuals in and around the protest areas of the city, but I can't tell you that they were specifically a part of one convoy or specifically a part of some group that had clearly established themselves as a major, if not a dominant factor. But there was criminal code level assaultive, threatening behavior that became the subject of criminal investigations. I don't know the status of those investigations.
Okay. And it's fair to say, though, that though the OPS wasn't enforcing things for broken windows or anything like that, that, of course, if there was a physical assault in downtown Ottawa, no matter that the protesters were there, that incident would be investigated and charges would be laid where appropriate, right?
Yes, sir, that would be my understanding.
Nobody from the OPS held off and wasn't enforcing the criminal code. They still were doing it in full force and effect. Is that fair?
They were, with the caveat again that officers had maximum discretion to assess whether or not, A, there was a need to make an actual arrest, B, whether or not that arrest would cause an escalation in public safety issues for the public, for those participating in demonstration, including the officers and other members themselves. But there was an expectation that they would still capture the evidence necessary and, if possible, pursue charges by law, provincial, or criminal federal statute at a later appropriate time.
Right. And would it surprise you to know, it's already in evidence, that in the time period between the start of the protest and when the invocation of the Emergencies Act came about, there was a total of 5 charges for assault in total?
I don't know the statistics, sir.
Thank you. So the second thing I want to talk to you about is the barricades that went up when the protest arrived, and I just want to get some clarification on that from you. I understand that the city put up the cement barricades, or whatever, they have a term for the type of barricade, but they put up the cement barricades where the vehicles were parked basically in the first few days, and that those barricades essentially would prevent any other vehicles from getting into where they were parked on the roadways or from leaving. Is that fair?
Again, my understanding is there may have been cement barricades used to close or redirect traffic routes even in advance of the convoys coming in. Certainly, I think as a general statement, once the quote-unquote red zones were established, that those red zones were largely demarked by barricades. I believe in the first weekend, there was a combination of different types of barricade usage, including the use of city-owned vehicles at some locations. And there were points along the red zone where there might have been a police vehicle and police officers either alone or in combination with a variety of barriers and barricades.
Right, because this commission has already heard some evidence, and even from the incident response group reports, that individual protesters with vehicles were wanting to leave but couldn't because they were barricaded in. Did you hear about that?
I don't recall the specifics. I do know that there were, on 2 levels, it would have been difficult to navigate through what had been established after the first weekend, and that would require some level of communication and assistance. But that there were several occasions throughout my tenure as chief of police where I was made aware that people wanting to leave within those zones were able to leave with some facilitation by the officers.
Because I understand that they weren't, and there's going to be evidence from our clients that that was a problem. They would ask to leave and they wouldn't remove the barricades. Did you hear anything about that?
Nothing specifically, but I could understand that there would be challenges in doing just that, logistical challenges. But I do recall specifically being told of a number of trucks, small vehicles, or individuals that were able to indicated they wanted to leave and then were able to, through logistics, to facilitate their departure. Small numbers is what my recollection is, but there were instances.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. And already in evidence is that on January 30th, 2022, you requested of Stephen Kay at the City of Ottawa to obtain an injunction, and you recall asking for that. Is that right?
Can you just give me the date again, sir?
January 30th, 2022. It was a phone call and then a follow-up email.
Again, my recollection is that we, at the Ottawa Police Service, started to consider a range of options, injunction being one of them, as mitigation options,
Yes.
post-incident response options. I don't know when the first communication would have went from the Ottawa Police Service to the city, and that might have predated that January 30th call with City Manager Steve Kanellakis, but I do recall that phone call with Steve Kanellakis, sir.
Right, and do you remember, I can put it up in front of you if you like, it's just a bit of bothersome, I'm hoping not to do it. Do you remember following up with him with an email just reciting your call and what you asked him, and he was then going to get back to you?
I don't have an independent recollection, sorry.
Okay, I don't need to put it up. But after you had that call, I take it that you had some ideas for the terms of what the injunction would look like if it was obtained, and you told him those things, I take it?
Again, there were very loose ideas at that point. We were still just trying to figure out what had landed in our city at that point.
Okay. And you then also provided Mr. Kay that the legal counsel, the internal legal counsel for OPS would assist with whatever evidence and whatever support they needed to obtain the injunction, correct?
I'd assigned my general counsel to lead that, and through her office, they would be the primary point of contact.
Right. And as a very senior police officer, you're aware that once you obtain an injunction, its terms can be enforced via the criminal code under Section 127 if people don't follow its terms, right?
I don't have a lot of experience with injunctions, sir, and how they tie into the criminal code. I will take you at face value.
Right. But it's fair to say that if an injunction was obtained, it would add another tool to the toolbox for enforcement purposes. Fair?
It would add another tool well beyond enforcement.
Yeah.
But that would be the potential benefit, that in the net, there would be a net benefit to addressing whatever the public safety issue was.
Right. And in your testimony last week, I take it that you agreed with the evidence of Inspector Bondoin with respect to crowd dynamics. Do you remember saying that?
Actually, I don't remember saying exactly that.
Yeah.
So for context, Commissioner, I think Inspector Bondoin provided fantastic context in general around crowd dynamics and theory to the Commissioner. I would encourage you to utilize that fully. The only place I might diverge somewhat from Inspector Bondoin, and I suspect if he had a chance to add clarity to my comment, I think we would find congruence. There were multiple crowds and therefore multiple crowd dynamics. So to describe the crowd within the red zone and then try to ascribe those dynamics to those in the neighborhoods and then to describe those to the dynamics of those in the suburban parts of our city, you couldn't do that. The dynamics literally sometimes changed block by block. The dynamics of the morning crowds were different from the dynamics of the evening and overnight crowds. Weekend dynamics were different from weekdays. So I just would put one small C cautionary note on the otherwise excellent testimony of Inspector Bondoin, that it wasn't a crowd, and that crowd wasn't static over a 24-hour period.
Right. But in his evidence, and I think you're in agreement with this, Inspector Bondoin talked about what has been referred to as the 80-20 rule. Do you remember hearing that?
I'm not sure he said 80-20 rule, but I understand the breakdown of dynamic of percentages, rough percentages that he was using.
Right, and just to reiterate that, it's presumed that 80% of a crowd in a protest are law-abiding. Is that right?
I think that's a general comment, yes.
And then the other 15% are what I would call on the fence. They could go either way. Maybe they're influenced, but there's that 15% factor.
That's what he was describing, sir, yes.
Yeah. and then 5% of the troublemakers. That's how he sort of summarized it. So would you agree that that's sort of the general rule with crowd dynamics?
I'm not an expert in crowd dynamics. I'll rely on Inspector Baudouin's testimony.
So if an injunction was obtained, I take it, I know you were just spitballing ideas at the time, but I take it that two of the terms for that, the major terms, would have, of course, been that the trucks that were blocking roadways due to where they were parked would be removed. Would that be fair?
Sorry, can you just repeat?
So if an injunction was to be obtained, I take it that you would have been looking for two important points. And the first I'd put to you is that the trucks that were blocking roadways due to where they were parked would be removed. Is that fair?
Unfortunately, no, sir, and it's only in this context. Pursuing a city injunction that led to that, I would first need to know that I had a reasonable reliability on the resources necessary to execute such an injunction. And quite frankly, I think until, well, certainly past my last day in office, I didn't have those resources.
Right. And of course, the OPS simply cannot go out and get an injunction themselves either, can they? The city does. Police officers and police services don't apply for injunctions. That's not happened.
That's correct, sir.
Right. And so it's fair to say that you were relying upon the city of Ottawa to obtain an injunction if one was going to be obtained.
Yes, sir.
Right. Now, I take it, though, if the city did go out and obtain an injunction, if the 80% rule was applied and that injunction was served on protesters, it's fair to say that some of them would have left after being served the injunction, right?
I think it's fair to say that, yes, some would see that as a reason, if they needed one, to leave at that point.
Absolutely. So if we can scroll down. So these are from February 2nd, and it's a meeting that all of you had. And there it says, Steve Kay had a meeting with the federal government today. And at the bottom, it says, not likely an injunction. So from your recollection of that meeting, did Steve Kay tell you that the feds told him not to get an injunction? Or whoever was representing Steve Kay at this meeting?
Yeah, thank you. I want to be very careful because I think I've suffered somewhat from this, trying to interpret other people's language from somebody else. So I want to be very careful on this. This is the 2nd of February, so
Yes.
this would have been the first time that City Manager Steve Kanellakis advised me that he'd been participating what I call tri-level calls.
Right.
Federal government, provincial government, municipal government. And he gave me a very quick overview of the one or more calls that he had been on. And that's my best recollection of his very brief overview. So I wouldn't want to ascribe anything particular to the federal government based on this line in this document.